The land that would one day bear the name Tennessee was once called the land between the rivers, a rolling expanse of forests, winding streams, and fertile soil caught between the Mississippi and the Cumberland. It was a place of abundance, but also of danger. The frontier families who settled there in the late 18th and early 19th centuries came seeking opportunity. They came to carve out farms and futures from the wilderness, to build homes, churches, and schools. Yet, for all its promise, the frontier was not empty. It was a place scarred by conflict, native tribes pushed from their lands, wars waged for control of fertile valleys, and the lingering memories of blood spilled on the soil. To live in the borderlands was to live in a space both rich with life and haunted by memory. The Bell family would not be the first to learn that sometimes the past clings to the present with a grip that cannot be broken. When John Bell moved his family from North Carolina to Robertson County, Tennessee in 1804, he believed he had found prosperity. He bought land along the Red River and built a farmstead that quickly became one of the finest in the region. By all accounts, he was a man of means, respected in his community, and his household was one of order and comfort. He had a wife, Lucy, and 9 children. Together, they tilled the land, raised livestock, and watched their fortunes grow. For over a decade, the Bells lived as successful farmers, their home standing as a symbol of security in a harsh frontier world. But if the land was rich, it was also restless. Strange things had been seen and heard in the Red River Valley long before the Bells arrived. Flickering lights in the trees, shadowy figures at the edge of fields, animals that appeared where they should not be and vanished when approached. For most, these were little more than tales told around the fire. For the Bells, they would soon become all too real. It began with something small. John Bell was walking the edges of his property one evening when he spotted a creature in the corn rows. He described it as a dog, but not like any he had seen before. Its body was massive, its head strangely shaped, its stance unnatural. He raised his gun and fired, certain he had killed it. But when he approached, the beast was gone. No tracks in the dirt, no blood, nothing to prove it had been there at all. Within days, more disturbances followed. Children saw strange birds perched on the fences, far larger than any turkey or vulture that should have been in the area. Lucy heard knocking at the walls when no one was outside. Footsteps crossed the porch at night but left no prints in the morning. The livestock grew restless. The dogs barked at empty air. At first, these things could be dismissed as tricks of the wilderness, nerves, or imagination. But then the sounds moved inside the house. Whispering voices began to be heard in the dark hours. At first faint, like the hiss of wind through the cracks in the cabin walls, but soon louder, clearer. Chains rattled, stones struck the roof, chairs scraped across the floor without human hands. The children cried out as something tugged their blankets away or pulled their hair. Betsy Bell, the youngest daughter, was pinched, slapped, and scratched by invisible hands that left marks on her skin. The family prayed, sang hymns, read scripture aloud, but the disturbances only grew stronger. The Bell household had become the stage for something unseen, something that defied explanation. And as word spread among neighbors, what had once been a private torment became the talk of the valley. The presence was not content to stay silent for long. It found its voice. At first, it was only a faint murmur, indistinct, words half-formed. But over time, the voice grew stronger until it could be heard as plainly as any human speech. The entity mocked the family, cursed them, laughed with a high, shrill tone or a low, guttural growl. It sang hymns in perfect tune, quoted scripture, and repeated conversations spoken in distant places as though it had been present to hear them. The neighbors who gathered to witness the haunting found themselves confronted with an intelligence that knew their names, their secrets, even their prayers. Some swore the voice could come from every corner of the room at once. It imitated the tones of family members and strangers alike. What had begun as a haunting had become something more, something that claimed an identity. When asked who or what it was, the voice gave many answers. Sometimes it called itself a spirit, sometimes a ghost of a restless native, sometimes a witch. The name that stuck was Kate. It declared itself to be Kate Batts's witch, linking its existence to a neighbour with whom John Bell had once quarrelled over a land deal. Whether or not Kate Batts herself had anything to do with the haunting, the entity adopted the title with relish. From that moment, it was known to the Bells and the wider community as the Bell Witch. And unlike most ghostly tales whispered at the edge of belief, this was not a story that lived in shadows. This was a haunting that placed itself squarely in the middle of public life. Ministers visited the Bell farm and left shaken. Neighbours came skeptical and departed in fear. Even General Andrew Jackson, future President of the United States, is said to have camped on the Bell property and encountered the witch himself. But before the story spread beyond the Red River, it was first and foremost the ordeal of a family. Night after night, the Bells lived with an intruder who could not be banished. Betsy, in particular, suffered mercilessly. She was struck, pinched, and her hair was tied in knots. At times she was lifted from her bed and flung across the room. Her cries echoed through the walls while the witch laughed with delight. John Bell, too, became the focus of its rage. His health began to decline, his speech faltered, and he suffered mysterious fits. The witch declared openly that she had come to kill him, and that she would not rest until he was in his grave. The Bell Witch was not only violent, it was cunning. It revealed knowledge no human should have. It predicted the outcome of events, recited sermons being preached in churches miles away, and repeated private conversations whispered in homes across the valley. People who doubted its power found themselves humiliated when the witch revealed secrets from their own lives. At times, it could be strangely helpful, alerting neighbors to dangers, even saving lives. But always, it returned to tormenting the Bells. Its moods shifted from cruel to mocking to eerily compassionate, but its presence never lessened. The family lived under siege by a voice that knew their fears, their weaknesses, and their faith. In the history of American folklore, few stories have carried such weight as the Bell Witch haunting. Unlike distant tales of European ghosts or whispered legends of ancient curses, this story took place on the American frontier, within living memory of the nation's founding. It involved ordinary people, prosperous farmers, devout Christians, and pillars of a growing community. It spread through first-hand testimony, neighbors swearing they heard the voice themselves, ministers declaring its reality from the pulpit, and skeptics silenced by their own encounters. It was not just a private haunting, but a community possession. And in time, it became something more, a national legend that would shape America's imagination of the supernatural for generations. To understand how the Bell Witch grew from knocks on a cabin wall to one of the most famous hauntings in the world, we must look closely at those first years in Robertson County, at the lives of the Bells, the land they settled, and the strange disturbances that refused to be ignored. For in the heart of Tennessee's wilderness, amid the rivers and forests of the early 19th century, a story unfolded that would terrify, fascinate, and endure in ways no one could have imagined. And as the witch found her voice, so too did America find one of its first great legends of the supernatural, a story not imported from the old world, but born on its own haunted soil. When John Bell first saw the land along the Red River, it must have seemed like the answer to every prayer a farmer could utter. The soil was dark and rich, the river close enough to provide water, the forests full of timber for building. It was a land in transition, where the wilderness gave way to cultivated fields, where families arriving from the Carolinas and Virginia sought to carve out a permanent future. In 1804, he brought his wife Lucy and their children to Tennessee with the promise of a new beginning. They left behind the pine ridges and sandy soil of North Carolina for a place that seemed to promise abundance in every direction. The Bell Farm quickly became one of the most prosperous in Robertson County. John acquired over 300 acres and steadily expanded his holdings. He built a large farmhouse, barns, and a network of fields that yielded tobacco, corn, and wheat. Neighbors remembered the Bell Farm as orderly and productive, a place where livestock grazed in good pastures and crops grew tall in the sun. In an era when survival on the frontier required backbreaking labor and constant vigilance, the Bells stood out as a family who had achieved not only security but comfort. They were known as devout, hard-working, and generous qualities that earned John Bell respect as a leading figure in the Red River community. Lucy Bell was remembered as a woman of quiet strength, deeply religious, and devoted to her household. She raised her children with firm discipline, but also with kindness. Neighbors spoke of her as the moral center of the family, a woman whose faith never wavered even when events would test it beyond what most could bear. Together, John and Lucy raised 9 children, a large family even by the standards of the early 19th century. Their home was alive with the voices of children, the routines of farm labor, and the rhythm of the seasons. From planting to harvest, from butchering to spinning, life on the Bell Farm followed the steady cycles of agrarian life. The Bells were not isolated. The Red River settlement was a close-knit community of farmers and tradesmen. Families depended on one another for help in times of sickness, for assistance at harvest, for defense against threats both human and natural. Neighbors often gathered at one another's homes for meals, for worship, for social gatherings. The Bells were at the center of this network. John Bell served as an elder in the Red River Baptist Church, a position of spiritual leadership that carried great respect. On Sundays, the family rode together in wagons or on horseback to worship, their presence a familiar sight along the country roads. It is important to understand that nothing about the Bells suggested they would one day be at the center of America's most famous haunting. They were not outcasts, not eccentrics, not people living at the margins. They were, in every way, the embodiment of frontier respectability. And perhaps that is why the events that would soon engulf them struck such a chord. For if a haunting could happen to the Bells, it could happen to anyone. The prosperity of the farm did not come without effort. Clearing fields from dense forests was brutal labor. Trees were felled by hand, stumps dug out, rocks hauled away. Cabins and barns were raised from the very timber that once shaded the land. Every board cut, every nail hammered, carried with it the sweat of human toil. The Bells were no strangers to hardship, but they endured it with the belief that their labor was building not just a farm, but a legacy for their children. And for nearly 2 decades, it seemed as if their effort had been rewarded. As the years passed, the family grew. The children reached adolescence, helping to run the farm, attending school, and participating in the life of the community. Betsy Bell, the youngest daughter, was especially beloved. Bright, spirited, and pretty, she was admired by neighbors and courted by young men of the settlement. John Bell Jr., the eldest son, was groomed to inherit responsibility for the farm, learning from his father how to manage crops, trade livestock, and lead in the community. By the second decade of the 19th century, the Bells had achieved what every frontier family dreamed of: land, security, reputation, and a future. And yet, beneath the surface, there were tensions that outsiders did not see. Land disputes were not uncommon in the Red River Valley. One such dispute involved John Bell and a neighbor named Kate Batts. Accounts differ as to the exact nature of their quarrel. Some say it was over the sale of land, others over livestock. Whatever the details, the disagreement left bitterness in its wake. Kate Batts was regarded by some as eccentric, even strange. She was a widow who managed her own affairs, spoke her mind, and did not always conform to the expectations of her neighbors. In time, when the haunting came, and a voice declared itself to be Kate Batts's witch, the old quarrel between the Bells and the Batts family became woven into the legend. But in the years before the haunting, the Bells' life appeared steady and enviable. The farm was thriving, the family respected, and their place in the community secure. Theirs was the story of the frontier dream fulfilled. They had left behind the crowded lands of the East, braved the uncertainties of the wilderness, and built something lasting. It was in this atmosphere of prosperity that the first disturbances came, subtle at first, then louder, until they shattered the peace of the Bell household. The very respectability that made the Bells admired also made their story impossible to dismiss. When John Bell spoke of strange animals in the fields, neighbors listened. When Lucy described knocks on the walls and voices in the night, the community took notice. And when Betsy Bell cried out from assaults no one could see, the horror that unfolded at Red River became not just the misfortune of one family, but a drama witnessed and debated by an entire community. To grasp the full weight of what happened to the Bells, one must remember the world they lived in. This was a deeply religious community, steeped in the language of Scripture, accustomed to seeing the hand of God and the work of the devil in the events of daily life. When the supernatural intruded, it was not merely a curiosity, it was a matter of eternal significance. A voice in the night was not just a ghostly whisper, it might be a demon, a messenger of judgment, or a test of faith. The Bell Witch did not merely haunt a house, it haunted a worldview, forcing an entire community to question the boundaries between the natural and the spiritual. The Bell family could not have known, as they settled into their new Tennessee home, that their name would one day be synonymous with terror. They could not have imagined that their farm would become a place of pilgrimage for the curious, the fearful, and the skeptical alike. For them, it was simply home, a place built with hard labor, sustained by faith, and filled with the laughter and cries of children. And it was into this home, this symbol of frontier success, that something unseen crept, whispering at the edges of their lives, waiting to reveal itself in full. The first signs came quietly, so quietly that they might have passed unnoticed if the family had not been so attuned to the rhythms of their home. On a frontier farm, every creak of wood, every shuffle of livestock, every shift in the wind meant something. A man like John Bell, who had built his farm from raw wilderness, knew the sounds of his land as well as he knew his own voice. And so, when something felt wrong, when a sound or a movement did not fit, he recognized it instantly. One evening, as the sun sank behind the trees and the shadows stretched across the fields, John was walking near the edge of his corn rows when he saw something that made his blood run cold. Between the stalks, partially hidden by the dimming light, was an animal unlike any he had seen. He described it later as a dog, but larger than any breed that should have roamed Tennessee. Its body seemed massive, its head oddly shaped, its stance unnatural. Startled, John raised his gun and fired. The shot rang out, echoing through the valley, and the figure collapsed. Certain he had hit his target, he approached the spot, yet when he reached it, there was nothing. No animal, no blood, not even tracks in the soft dirt. The field was empty, as though nothing had ever been there at all. It might have ended as a strange tale to tell the children, an odd sighting, a trick of the light, a hunter's mistake, had it not been followed by more encounters. Within days, other members of the family began to see things just as unnatural. Drury, one of the younger sons, spotted a great bird perched on the fence, far larger than any turkey, vulture, or hawk common to the area. He shouted for his siblings, but when they looked, the bird vanished without a trace. Betsy saw what she thought was a girl in a green dress swinging from a tree branch in the yard. She ran closer, only for the figure to dissolve into empty air. Even the farm animals grew restless, lowing, stamping, and staring at spaces where no threat could be seen. At night, the house itself became unsettled. Knocks began to sound against the walls, at first faint, as though a loose shutter tapped in the wind, but soon louder, rhythmic, deliberate. The sound traveled from one side of the cabin to the other, circling the family as they sat by the fire. Footsteps moved across the porch, heavy as a man's boots, but when John flung the door open, there was only darkness and silence. The dogs barked furiously at unseen intruders, their hackles raised, their bodies rigid with fear. When the family searched the yard with lanterns, they found nothing. The disturbances crept inward. At night, as the children tried to sleep, their blankets were tugged from their beds. Tiny hands, unseen, plucked at their hair. Betsy cried out when something scratched at her legs, leaving red welts on her skin. The younger children whimpered, clutching at their mother, begging for protection from forces she could not fight. Lucy tried to soothe them with hymns and prayer, her voice steady though her own hands trembled. John read scripture aloud, his words ringing through the darkened house. But the noises only grew bolder, mocking, answering scripture with knocks, answering hymns with laughter. The sound of gnawing teeth echoed through the halls as though rats swarmed the furniture, yet no vermin could be found. Stones struck the roof in the middle of the night, rattling down the shingles, but when dawn came, no stones were seen on the ground. Chains rattled in the darkness, heavy links dragging across the floor, though nothing moved. The children swore they heard whispers, words half-formed, curling in the air like smoke. At first, the voices were indistinct, nothing more than murmurs, but with each passing week, they grew clearer, as though something unseen was learning to speak. The torment fell most heavily upon Betsy. At only 12 years old, she became the target of unseen hands. She was pinched and slapped, her hair pulled until she screamed. Sometimes she was lifted from her bed and thrown across the room with a force no human hand could account for. Red marks appeared on her face, welts on her arms, bruises on her legs. The other children saw it happen. Lucy saw it, John saw it, and there was no denying that something inhuman had laid its hand upon their daughter. The fear that gripped the household deepened with every blow. At first, the family tried to keep the disturbances private. On the frontier, reputation was survival. To admit that your home was plagued by something unnatural was to invite gossip, ridicule, even suspicion. Witchcraft was a word no one wanted spoken in their household, yet the disturbances refused to remain hidden. Neighbors who visited the Bell farm heard the knocks themselves. They saw Betsy's torments, heard her cries, and could not explain what they witnessed. When word spread through the Red River settlement, some dismissed it as fancy, others as deceit, but many came to see for themselves, and what they found shook them to the core. The voices grew stronger, at first only mutters, then words, then whole phrases. The unseen presence laughed, cursed, mocked the family. It sang hymns in a voice both sweet and chilling, recited scripture word for word, and even repeated conversations spoken in distant homes. Ministers were called to the house. Some entered confident that they would banish the presence with prayer. Many left shaken, muttering that they had heard the devil himself. The haunting had outgrown the walls of the Bell cabin. It had become a phenomenon that drew the attention of an entire community. In the long nights of fear, Lucy clung to her faith. She urged her children to pray, to resist despair. John, once a pillar of strength, grew gaunt and weary, his eyes hollowed by sleepless nights. He walked the farm with his rifle in hand, though no bullet could harm the thing that plagued them. Betsy, once a lively and spirited girl, grew pale and withdrawn, her youth marked by bruises and terror. The household that had once been the picture of frontier success now trembled with every knock, every whisper, every laugh in the dark. Neighbors began to take sides. Some believed the Bells were cursed for hidden sins. Others insisted the devil had chosen their home as a battlefield. Still others whispered that perhaps it was indeed a witch, a human soul twisted with malice, striking at the family through unseen means. Whatever the explanation, there was no denying the reality of what was happening. Too many had heard the voice, too many had seen the marks on Betsy's skin, too many had watched objects move without human hands. What had begun with a single strange animal in the cornfield had become a siege. The Bell family lived every day under the shadow of something that defied explanation, something that would not relent. The Red River settlement could no longer look away. The haunting was not only a private nightmare, it was becoming a story that would reach beyond Tennessee, a tale of terror that would one day be known across America. And as the voice in the Bell household grew stronger, as it learned to speak with clarity and intelligence, the haunting prepared to enter a new stage, one in which it would no longer be content to scratch and knock, but would claim an identity all its own. When the whispers in the Bell household sharpened into words, everything changed. A haunting of knocks and scratches could be dismissed as imagination, nerves, or perhaps a cruel trick by some hidden neighbor. But a voice that spoke, a voice that answered questions, a voice that seemed to know things no mortal should know, that was something else entirely. It meant that the family was not simply under attack by random noises in the night. They were living with an intelligence, unseen yet undeniable, one that could listen, learn, and reply. At first, the words were faint, little more than murmurs. In the stillness of the cabin, when the fire had burned low and the children had been tucked into their beds, the sound would rise from the shadows. A phrase half heard, a name spoken as though from a great distance, the cadence of a prayer, but broken into fragments. The family strained to hear, to decide if they were truly listening to speech or only the creak of timbers, the sigh of wind. But then the words came clearer. The voice called out their names. It repeated lines of scripture Lucy had read aloud. It mocked John with coarse insults, its tone sharp with contempt. Soon it became impossible to deny. Everyone in the house heard it, and when neighbors were invited to stay the night, they too heard a disembodied voice rise from the darkness. Some swore it came from the corners of the room, others from just above their heads, still others from beneath the floorboards. Yet no matter where they searched, there was nothing to see. The voice was not bound to one place. It could echo from the walls, the rafters, the very air itself. The most disturbing aspect was not only that the voice spoke, but that it grew. With each passing week, its speech became clearer, its vocabulary richer. It moved from single words to full sentences, from muttering to conversation. It was not random. It listened when spoken to. It answered questions. It argued. It taunted. It laughed. It had memory, recalling events from days before. It had knowledge, recounting things that had occurred miles away. And above all, it had personality, shifting, contradictory, but undeniably present. Neighbors who came skeptical found themselves drawn into conversation with something they could not see. The voice mocked them, repeating their own words back in a twisted parody. At other times it flattered, reciting scripture with perfect accuracy, even singing hymns in a voice so pure it left listeners shaken. It was as though the Bell household had become the stage for a drama performed by an actor no one could glimpse, a performer whose talent ranged from comedy to tragedy, from blasphemy to devotion. What unsettled the community most was the voice's uncanny knowledge. It repeated sermons being preached in churches miles away, as if it had been in attendance. It recited conversations whispered in private homes, secrets no outsider could know. When challenged, it offered details about families, about lives, about past events that stunned those who heard them. Skeptics who came determined to expose a hoax sometimes left pale and trembling, their doubts shaken by words that cut too close to truths they had never shared aloud. The entity reveled in its ability to unsettle. It delighted in humiliating those who mocked it, revealing their secrets, exposing their weaknesses. Yet, at other times, it showed a strange benevolence, warning neighbors of dangers, even saving lives. One story told how the voice alerted a visitor to a sick child at home, urging him to leave immediately. When he returned, he found the child near death but saved by his timely arrival. Such incidents blurred the lines between malice and aid, making the voice all the more inscrutable. For the bells, however, there was little relief. The voice singled out Betsy for torment, calling her names, threatening her, mocking her innocence. It accused her of sins she had never committed, whispered obscenities in her ear, and laughed as she wept. For John Bell, the patriarch, the voice reserved a special hatred. It declared openly that it had come to destroy him, that he was marked for death. It mocked his leadership, his health, his prayers. It described his ailments in cruel detail, and as his strength waned, it claimed triumph, boasting that it would be the one to end him. The presence of the voice transformed the Bell household into a gathering place for the curious. Ministers, neighbors, travelers, people came from miles around to hear it. The cabin became crowded at night, men and women sitting in silence until the voice rose. Some begged it to prove itself, and it did. It recited passages of scripture chosen at random, repeated words whispered out of earshot, sang verses of hymns no one in the room had sung in years. The more it performed, the more its reputation spread. The Bell Witch, as it came to be known, was no longer only the torment of a single family. It had become a spectacle, a phenomenon that reached beyond the Red River Valley. Among those who came was General Andrew Jackson, a man already famous for his military exploits and destined to become President of the United States. Accounts vary, but legend holds that Jackson and his men camped near the Bell farm, eager to test the witch for themselves. When their horses balked and refused to move, the general declared, "By the eternal boys, this is the witch." That night, Jackson and his men listened as the voice mocked them, exposed their private sins, and drove them away shaken. Whether this story unfolded exactly as told or grew in the retelling, its presence in the legend demonstrates how far the fame of the Bell Witch had spread. It was no longer a local haunting, but a matter of national curiosity. The voice's shifting nature puzzled everyone. At times it seemed a blasphemer, cursing and mocking religion. At others it was pious, reciting scripture, singing hymns, even praying. It claimed to be a spirit, a ghost, a demon, a witch. Sometimes it said it was the soul of a restless native whose bones lay beneath the Bell farm. Other times it said it was the spirit of a woman wronged, seeking revenge. Most often, it identified itself as Kate, and so the legend of Kate Batts's witch took firm root. Whether it was truly connected to the eccentric neighbor Kate Batts mattered little. The voice had named itself, and the name stuck. What is most striking, looking back, is how quickly the voice became woven into the life of the community. It was not dismissed as imagination or ignored as a family's private torment. It was accepted, debated, feared, and courted. Men and women of faith sought to interpret its meaning, to decide whether it was a demon sent by Satan or a spirit allowed by God for some hidden purpose. Some treated it with awe, others with fear, still others with fascination. But no one who heard it could deny its existence. For the Bells, the voice was no curiosity. It was a living presence in their home, unpredictable and unrelenting. They woke and slept to its words, endured its mockery, and watched as it turned their private lives into a public spectacle. For Betsy, the torment deepened, her youth overshadowed by ridicule and abuse from a thing she could not escape. For John, each passing day felt heavier, as though the voice itself was draining his strength. And for Lucy, the faithful mother, there was only the resolve to endure, to cling to her faith and protect her children as best she could. The haunting had reached a stage no one had imagined. What began with knocks and scratches had become a dialogue with the unseen. The Bell Witch spoke, argued, sang, mocked, and prophesied. It was no longer content to hide in shadows. It demanded to be heard. And as its reputation grew, so too did its power, until the name of the Bell family and the voice in their home became inseparable, forever bound in a legend that continues to haunt American memory. The voice had been many things in its earliest days: a whisper in the dark, a murmur at the edge of hearing, a mocking echo of scripture, a chorus of hymns sung with eerie precision. It had claimed at times to be a spirit of the dead, other times the soul of a Native American whose rest had been disturbed, still other times a demon sent to test the faith of the Bells. But of all its shifting masks, one identity rose above the others, one that would cling to it in the minds of the family and their neighbors for generations. It began to call itself Kate. The choice was not accidental. John Bell had once quarreled with a woman in the community named Kate Batts. She was known as eccentric, outspoken, quick to anger, and not afraid to pursue her affairs with a boldness uncommon for women of her time. To some, she was merely odd; to others, unsettling. She had accused Bell of cheating her in a land deal years before, and though the dispute had not led to violence, the bitterness remained. So when the disembodied voice in the Bell household announced itself as Kate the Witch, and sometimes even Kate Batts's Witch, the association was immediate. The community whispered that Kate Batts had conjured a spirit to plague her enemy. The voice itself seemed to relish this link, insisting again and again that it was indeed Kate, come to torment John Bell until his death. Once the entity adopted this identity, it never relinquished it, though it would still shift between claiming to be a spirit, a ghost, or even a demon. The name Kate became its anchor. The Bells spoke of Kate as though she were a constant, a familiar presence, albeit one that hated them with a venom few could fathom. Neighbors soon spoke of the Bell Witch, a phrase that spread through Robertson County like wildfire, and with it, the idea that what haunted the Bells was not merely a ghost, but a witch in spirit form. With this name came a sharper focus to the haunting. No longer was it content to scratch at the walls, to sing and laugh. It began to declare its purpose with clarity. It said openly that it had come to kill John Bell. It mocked his failing health, taunted him with visions of his grave, and promised that it would be the one to put him in it. The family had already watched him grow weaker, his speech faltering, his hands trembling with unexplained fits. Now the voice jeered at his suffering, proclaiming each decline as its own victory. Kate's cruelty toward John was unrelenting, but her obsession with Betsy was just as disturbing. Betsy Bell, by now a young teenager, was caught in a torment that defied reason. She was slapped across the face by invisible hands, her hair pulled until strands tore loose, her body lifted and thrown against the walls. She tried to sleep, but was woken by whispers in her ear, mocking her, threatening her, cursing her youth and beauty. The abuse grew so severe that the family sometimes sent her to stay with neighbors, but even there the attacks followed. Wherever Betsy went, Kate's voice found her. What troubled the community most was that Kate did not only torment, she conversed. She argued scripture with ministers, quoting verses with precision. She engaged in theological debates, sometimes affirming her belief in God, other times mocking his name. She sang hymns, sometimes in harmony with those gathered, sometimes in twisted parody. She answered questions posed by strangers, repeating words whispered in secret to prove her knowledge. At times she spoke with tenderness, even professing admiration for Lucy Bell, saying she was the finest woman who had ever walked the earth. But these moments of respect were always overshadowed by cruelty toward John and Betsy. The contradiction only deepened the mystery. Stories of Kate's knowledge spread quickly. Visitors from miles away came to the Bell home to test her. They asked questions about distant events, and Kate answered with shocking accuracy. She repeated sermons being preached in churches at that very moment, word for word, though the buildings were miles away. She revealed private details of lives she could not have known. Some left believing she was a divine spirit, others convinced she was a demon. But none could deny that she spoke with intelligence and awareness that could not be explained. The adoption of the name Kate also transformed the haunting into a social phenomenon. In early America, witchcraft was never far from the imagination. Though the Salem trials were more than a century past, the fear of witches, curses, and the devil's work remained strong in the religious life of frontier communities. For an invisible voice to name itself a witch was to step directly into the collective fears of the people. It made the haunting more than a private ordeal. It became a communal terror, a story that touched upon the oldest anxieties of settlers in a new land, anxieties of forces unseen, of neighbors who might harbor hidden malice, of the devil's hand at work in the wilderness. Kate's words were not only threats and mockery, they were also prophecies. She predicted events that would come to pass, some trivial, others grave. She foretold visitors before they arrived, recounted their journeys as though she had traveled with them, and sometimes even warned of dangers. These predictions, when fulfilled, only deepened the sense of awe and dread surrounding her. The line between tormentor and oracle blurred. The Bell Witch became not only a haunting, but a voice of fate, one that both terrified and fascinated those who heard it. The more Kate spoke, the more her legend grew. Robertson County buzzed with stories of the Bell Witch. Travelers carried the tale beyond Tennessee, spreading it through word of mouth until the haunting became known across the South. Some came to hear her speak, others to test her, others simply to witness the strange events at the Bell farm. The Bell household, once a private refuge, became a stage where the supernatural performed before crowds, and always at the center of it was Kate, the voice that had chosen to name itself, to root itself in human conflict, and to declare its purpose with terrifying certainty. What made Kate different from other tales of witches and spirits was her refusal to remain silent or hidden. Most hauntings were whispered about, half-believed, fleeting glimpses in the dark. Kate demanded attention. She shouted, she argued, she sang. She made herself undeniable, inserting herself into the daily lives of the Bells and their neighbors. By choosing a name, by attaching herself to a quarrel between John Bell and a neighbor, she grounded herself in human affairs. She was no longer just a ghost. She was a participant in community life, a presence that shaped conversations, decisions, and reputations. For John Bell, the naming of Kate was a curse with no escape. Every time the voice mocked him, it was not only the torment of the unseen, but the echo of his dispute with a neighbor, the reminder of a bitterness unresolved. For Betsy, the attacks intensified under Kate's name, as though the entity had found a sharper edge to its malice. For Lucy, even the moments of praise were cruel in their way, for they forced her to live in a household where her tormentor posed as both admirer and destroyer. The Bell Witch, now firmly identified as Kate, had become more than a haunting. She was a legend in the making, an intelligence that shaped her own narrative, weaving herself into the lives of her victims and the fears of her community. And as her name spread, so too did her power, until the farm on the Red River was no longer simply a prosperous homestead, but the stage of America's most infamous haunting, a place where a witch's voice declared itself in the night and promised death to those who lived within. By the time the voice had settled into the name Kate, the Bell family was already fraying under the pressure. Life in the Red River settlement had once been marked by the rhythm of farming seasons, church gatherings, and neighborly visits. But now, every hour of the Bells' lives was overshadowed by an enemy they could not see, one who seemed to know their every thought and took pleasure in twisting it. The farm that had been a symbol of prosperity was transformed into a battlefield. It was no longer a home, but a fortress under constant siege. and the enemy needed no army, no weapons, no gates to breach. The enemy was already inside, woven into every wall, every room, every breath of the house. The attacks did not come in predictable waves, but in a cruel rhythm that denied the family any sense of rest. At night, the knocks on the walls gave way to shrill laughter, to chains dragging across the floorboards, to footsteps pacing just beyond the bedchamber doors. Sometimes the noises lasted for hours, as though Kate delighted in wearing down her victims through exhaustion. On other nights, she withheld her voice, letting the silence stretch until every creak of timber set nerves on edge, only to return suddenly with a violent slap across Betsy's face or a mocking whisper in John's ear. There was no pattern, no safe hour. Every moment of peace was only a pause before the next assault. Betsy's torment became the most visible sign of the hauntings' cruelty. She was pinched until bruises covered her arms, scratched until welts marked her skin, and slapped so hard that the sound echoed through the cabin. Neighbors saw it happen with their own eyes. They watched her hair pulled from her scalp, her body jerked across the floor by unseen hands. Some tried to hold her down to protect her, but their grip was useless against whatever force had claimed her. Betsy grew pale and thin, her once bright spirit dimmed by nights of pain and days of humiliation. No matter where she went, the voice followed. When she stayed with friends or relatives, Kate's laughter rose from the rafters, her whispers coiled in Betsy's ears, her blows landed with the same cruel force. There was no escape. John Bell's suffering was slower, more insidious. His once commanding presence began to wither. His speech faltered, his face twitched with spasms he could not control, and his body weakened. He staggered when he walked, his hands trembled when he worked. Kate never let him forget his decline. She jeered at his failing health, announcing to all who would listen that she had come to kill him. Each fit, each stumble, was met with her shrill laughter, her taunts that the grave was waiting. For a man who had once been the head of his community, an elder of the church, the degradation was as painful as the illness itself. The haunting did not only aim to end his life, but to strip him of his dignity piece by piece. Lucy Bell, though spared the direct blows of Kate's violence, carried a different burden. The voice often spoke of her with strange admiration, calling her the best of women, praising her kindness and virtue. But these compliments, coming from the mouth of the very thing that tormented her family, were as cruel as curses. To be singled out for respect while her husband and daughter were attacked left Lucy in an impossible position. She clung to her faith, praying ceaselessly, reading scripture aloud, urging her children to hold firm. But even her prayers were mocked, repeated back by Kate in a sing-song tone, twisted into parody. Lucy stood firm, but each day weighed heavier. The other Bell children lived in a state of constant fear. Blankets were torn from their beds, voices hissed in their ears, and objects moved without human touch. They watched their sister beaten and their father mocked, powerless to intervene. Their once lively home became a place of dread, where laughter was drowned out by Kate's taunts, and every creak of the house brought a shiver of anticipation. Childhood in the Bell home was marked not by innocence, but by terror, a reality they could never explain to those who had not lived it. The community, once curious, began to see the haunting as a spectacle. Crowds gathered at the Bell farm, hoping to hear Kate speak, to witness her tricks, to test her knowledge. Some came out of fascination, others from faith, others simply from a hunger for entertainment. The Bell home became a stage, the family unwilling actors in a play scripted by their tormentor. Kate reveled in the attention, answering questions, exposing secrets, humiliating skeptics. The Bells, meanwhile, lived with the shame of being on display, their suffering consumed by others, as though it were a story rather than their reality. What made the siege unbearable was Kate's unpredictability. At times she was playful, telling stories, singing hymns, engaging visitors in long conversations. At other times she was vicious, hurling curses, striking Betsy, tormenting John. She could switch from mockery to praise in a heartbeat, keeping the family constantly off balance. There was no reasoning with her, no way to bargain, no way to appease. She was not a force that could be placated with offerings or banished with rituals. She was an intelligence that thrived on control, and she had chosen the Bell family as her prey. The Bells tried everything they knew to drive her away. They prayed aloud, they sang hymns until their voices broke. They invited ministers to the house to confront her. None of it worked. Some ministers left shaken, unable to explain what they had heard. Others insisted the family endure, framing the haunting as a test of faith. But no prayer, no sermon, no exorcism silenced Kate. If anything, she seemed to grow stronger with each attempt to banish her, mocking the efforts as futile. As the months dragged into years, the Bells lived not only with fear, but with exhaustion. Sleep became rare, meals were interrupted, daily chores overshadowed by dread. The farm, once prosperous, began to show signs of neglect. Fields went untended, repairs were delayed. The weight of survival itself became heavier. Neighbors helped where they could, but many were wary of spending too much time at the Bell farm, fearing that Kate's attention might follow them home. The family found themselves increasingly isolated, surrounded by community but trapped in a nightmare no one else could carry for them. Yet, for all the torment, there were moments when Kate's presence blurred the line between haunting and possession. She inserted herself into decisions, offered warnings, even provided knowledge that seemed useful. She predicted the arrival of visitors, recounted their journeys, warned of dangers ahead. Some neighbors, shaken by her accuracy, began to see her as more than a tormentor. To them, she was an oracle, a voice of hidden truths, one whose words carried weight even when cloaked in cruelty. This only deepened the mystery of who or what Kate truly was. For the Bells, however, there was no such ambiguity. To them, she was nothing but a destroyer, one who took pleasure in pain, one who sought the death of their patriarch and the ruin of their peace. Every day under Kate's voice was another day of siege, another day of waiting for the next blow, another day of enduring the unendurable. Their home had become a prison, and their jailer was a witch whose chains were invisible, but no less binding. And yet, the siege was not the climax. It was only the middle of the story, the long torment that prepared the ground for what Kate promised from the start, the death of John Bell. Her words grew sharper, her threats clearer, until the entire family and community understood that the haunting would not end with mere torment. It was driving towards something final, something that would bind the name of the Bell Witch forever to death itself. Of all the members of the Bell family, none suffered more at the hands of Kate than Betsy. From the first whispers that tugged her awake at night to the violent blows that left her bruised and terrified, she became the chosen victim, the one whom the witch singled out with a malice so personal that even those who doubted the haunting were forced to confront the evidence of her torment. Betsy's life, once marked by the promise of youth, was turned into a trial that blurred the line between the natural and the impossible. She was only 12 when the first attacks began. At first, they were small things: a tug at her hair, the feeling of fingers brushing against her skin, a faint whisper close to her ear. But they grew bolder and more violent with each passing week. Neighbors and visitors saw it with their own eyes. She would be struck across the face by an invisible hand, the sound of the blow echoing in the room while red welts rose on her cheek. She would be lifted from her bed and flung onto the floor, her cries cutting through the night as her family rushed to her side, helpless to intervene. Her hair was yanked in knots so violently that strands tore away, leaving her scalp raw. She was pinched, scratched, beaten, humiliated in ways that seemed designed not just to cause pain, but to break her spirit. The cruelty was relentless. Betsy could not escape it. When she stayed at home, the torment followed her into every room. When her parents sent her to stay with neighbors in the hope that distance might bring relief, the voice appeared there too, mocking her, striking her, making clear that she was the target, not the place. It was as if Kate had bound herself to Betsy, determined to haunt her wherever she went. The attacks left visible marks, bruises on her arms, scratches across her skin, that shocked those who witnessed them. Some visitors tried to hold her down when the attacks came, hoping to shield her from the invisible hands, but their efforts were in vain. Betsy's body would jerk and twist as if pulled by a force beyond human strength. No one who saw it could claim it was mere imagination. Too many people heard the cries, saw the marks, felt the terror in the room. What deepened the tragedy was that Betsy was not only a victim of violence but also of ridicule. Kate mocked her mercilessly, whispering obscenities, cursing her beauty, accusing her of sins she had never committed. The voice followed her through the day, sometimes speaking directly into her ear, other times announcing its taunts for the whole family to hear. Betsy could not escape humiliation any more than she could escape pain. Her every action, her every word became fodder for the witch's cruelty. As Betsy grew older, her suffering took on new dimensions. By the time she was a teenager, she had caught the attention of Joshua Gardner, a young man from the community. Their courtship was innocent, marked by affection and the promise of a future together. For Betsy, who had endured years of torment, Joshua was a light, a symbol that perhaps her life might move beyond the shadow of Kate. But the witch would not allow it. From the moment their relationship deepened, Kate turned her malice upon it. Whenever Betsy and Joshua were together, the voice rose louder, cursing them, shouting obscenities, mocking their affection. The attacks on Betsy grew more violent when Joshua was present, as though Kate meant to drive a wedge between them. The community whispered that the witch disapproved of the match, though no one could say why. Some believed Kate acted out of jealousy, others that she was determined to prevent Betsy from finding happiness. Whatever the reason, the effect was undeniable. Betsy and Joshua's moments together became unbearable, always overshadowed by a presence that mocked, struck, and cursed. The pressure wore on Betsy. She longed for a normal life, for love, for marriage, but every attempt was thwarted by Kate's intrusion. Her dreams of building a future with Joshua faded under the relentless assault. At last, overwhelmed by despair and convinced she could never escape the witch's hatred, Betsy broke off the engagement. It was not a decision made lightly, nor one free of pain. She loved Joshua, but she could not condemn him to share her torment. Kate had won, driving a wedge between them until their bond could no longer hold. This loss crushed Betsy more deeply than any bruise or slap. The physical abuse she had learned to endure, but the destruction of her hope for a future, the loss of love, cut deeper. She wept bitterly, her spirit broken by the realization that Kate's shadow reached even into her heart. Neighbors pitied her, but pity could not protect her. Ministers prayed over her, but prayers brought no relief. She became a figure of tragedy in the community, a young woman robbed of her youth by an enemy no one could touch. For John Bell, the sight of his daughter's suffering added to his own burden. Already weakened by illness, already mocked by Kate as she claimed his death, he watched helplessly as Betsy endured torments he could not stop. His failure to protect her, to shield his family, weighed on him like a stone. The witch's hatred for him seemed bound up in her cruelty toward Betsy, as if destroying the daughter was another way of breaking the father. The siege of the Bell family was not only against their bodies, but against their bonds of love and hope. The community could not look away. Too many had seen Betsy's torment with their own eyes. Too many had heard Kate's voice shouting obscenities. Too many had watched her engagement collapse under the pressure. The story spread farther, carried by travelers, ministers, and neighbors, until the name of the Bell Witch was known across Tennessee and beyond. And always at the heart of the tale was Betsy, the girl who bore the brunt of the haunting, the one whose suffering became the symbol of Kate's malice. Even in later years, long after the haunting had eased, Betsy carried the scars. She would go on to marry and raise a family, but the shadow of her youth never lifted. Those who knew her said she was haunted, not only by memories, but by the sense that Kate had stolen something she could never regain: her innocence, her hope, her chance at a life unshackled by fear. The legend of the Bell Witch may have grown into folklore, but for Betsy, it was not a story. It was the reality of her youth, a reality she could never escape. The haunting of Betsy Bell was not an isolated cruelty, but part of the larger pattern of Kate's war against the family. Yet it stood out as the most visceral, the most undeniable, the most tragic. The bruises on her skin, the broken engagement, the years of fear, all these gave flesh and blood to the haunting, made it impossible to dismiss as rumor or exaggeration. Through Betsy, the witch made herself visible, not as a shadow in the night, but as a force that left marks, destroyed lives, and reshaped the destiny of a family. And still, Kate's purpose was not complete. She had vowed to kill John Bell, and as Betsy's suffering deepened, so too did her father's decline. The family was being crushed from two sides, through the torment of the daughter and the slow death of the patriarch. The haunting, now a spectacle for the community and a tragedy for the family, was moving toward the moment Kate had promised all along, the death that would bind her legend forever. From the earliest days of the haunting, Kate made her intentions unmistakable. She mocked John Bell more than anyone else in the family, cursed his name, and declared that she had come to kill him. Unlike her shifting treatment of others, mocking Betsy, but sometimes praising Lucy, humiliating neighbors, but occasionally saving lives, her hatred for John was constant. Every visitor to the Bell farm heard her say it. The patriarch was marked, and she would not rest until he lay in his grave. At first, John tried to dismiss the threats. He was a man of reputation, a respected elder of the church, and not one to be cowed by idle words. But as the months passed, his health began to fail in ways that no doctor could explain. His speech faltered, his tongue stiffening as though he could not form words. His face twitched with spasms, his jaw trembling uncontrollably. At times, he struggled to swallow, choking on food as though an invisible hand pressed against his throat. His body weakened, his steps unsteady, his strength diminished. Kate never let him suffer in silence. She jeered at every stumble, laughed at every fit, and told all who listened that she was the cause. When he could not speak, she mocked his silence. When he staggered, she shouted triumphantly that her hand had pushed him. When he groaned in pain, she declared it was her work, a slow death she had chosen for him. For John, once the head of his household, once a pillar of his community, the humiliation was as cruel as the illness. He had lived his life as a leader, but Kate stripped him of dignity, leaving him broken before his family and neighbors. The decline was relentless. Friends urged him to rest, ministers prayed over him, but nothing slowed his deterioration. Doctors visited, examining him with the limited tools of early 19th century medicine, but none could explain his condition. Some whispered that it was a stroke, others that it was a wasting disease. But the presence of Kate's voice, mocking every symptom, claiming responsibility, made such explanations feel hollow. For the Bells and their neighbors, there was no doubt the witch was killing him. Kate relished the attention. She announced openly that John's days were numbered, that she would have the satisfaction of being the one to end him. She taunted his family, telling them to prepare his grave, to ready themselves for the loss of their father. She even told visitors the date of his death, boasting that she would not be denied. Each time John's health faltered, she laughed with delight, pointing to his decline as proof of her power. As John grew weaker, his family suffered alongside him. Lucy watched helplessly as her husband withered, her prayers mocked, her faith tested beyond measure. The children, already tormented by nightly assaults, now saw their father slipping away, his once strong voice silenced, his hands trembling, his body failing. Betsy, already broken by years of torment, wept for a father who could not protect her and whom she could not save. Neighbors, too, were shaken. Many had doubted, many had come to the Bell home out of curiosity, but as John Bell declined, the mocking voice of Kate echoing in their ears, few could maintain skepticism. Whatever was happening, it was not mere imagination. They heard her taunts, they saw his trembling body, they witnessed the humiliation of a man undone by something no human hand could explain. The end came slowly, cruelly. In the fall of 1820, John's health deteriorated sharply. He could no longer speak clearly, his body racked with fits, his strength nearly gone. Kate declared that his time had come. The family kept close watch over him, tending him with devotion. But the witch hovered in every room, mocking, jeering, reveling in his suffering. When he tried to pray, she shouted over him. When he tried to rest, she disturbed the air with laughter and curses. His final days were marked not by peace, but by torment. His last hours stolen by the voice that had haunted him for years. On December 20th, 1820, John Bell died. His passing, already devastating to his family, was made grotesque by Kate's triumph.
The moment his death was discovered, the voice rang through the house, shrieking with laughter, proclaiming victory. She boasted that she had killed him, that she had at last fulfilled her promise. The family, crushed with grief, could find no comfort, for even in death their patriarch was mocked. Kate sang loudly, celebrating his end as though it were her greatest triumph. The cruelty did not stop there. At his funeral, as neighbors gathered to pay respects, Kate's voice rose again. She laughed, cursed, and mocked the dead man as he lay in his coffin. The mourners, already shaken by years of stories, heard the voice ring out, jeering at their grief. It was a spectacle of horror, unlike anything the community had ever seen. A funeral disrupted by a witch who claimed her victim from beyond the veil. For the Bells, John's death was the final blow. The man who had built their farm, who had guided their family, was gone, and the witch who tormented them had taken credit. The haunting did not end with his passing, but it had reached its climax. Kate had declared her purpose, carried it out, and reveled in her triumph. The siege of the Bell family had achieved its most terrible goal. For the community, John Bell's death cemented the legend. It was one thing to hear voices, to see bruises, to witness strange occurrences. It was another to watch a respected man wither under illness while an unseen presence claimed responsibility and then die with that presence celebrating.
Doubt was no longer possible for many. The Bell Witch was no mere tale. It was a reality that had taken a life. And yet, even with John gone, Kate did not vanish. She lingered, mocking the family still, taunting Betsy, inserting herself into daily life as though the death of the patriarch was only part of her design. The Bell household remained under her shadow, the family still living with her voice, her laughter, her unpredictable cruelty. John's death had not freed them. It had only proved that Kate's threats were not idle. She had promised to kill him, and he was dead. What remained was the question that no one could answer. Who or what was Kate? Was she truly the spirit of a wronged woman seeking revenge? A demon sent to test the faithful? The restless ghost of some long-forgotten soul? Or was she something older, something woven into the land itself, a force that had chosen the Bells as her victims? The community debated, ministers preached, skeptics argued, but no explanation could erase the memory of John Bell's decline or the sound of Kate's laughter at his funeral. The Bell family, stripped of their patriarch, could do nothing but endure. Lucy gathered her children, urged them to hold to their faith, and carried the burden of survival. Betsy, broken by torment and loss, faced a future overshadowed by fear. and the name of Kate, once whispered in curiosity, became a curse that echoed across Tennessee.
The witch had killed John Bell, and in doing so, had written herself into the history of a young nation.
By the time John Bell lay in his grave, the haunting had already grown beyond the boundaries of one farmstead. What had begun as the private affliction of a single family had spread like fire through the Red River settlement and beyond, until it seemed as though every man, woman, and child in the county had a story of the Bell Witch to tell. Some spoke of her with awe, others with fear, others with the knowing smirk of those who had seen enough of the world to believe in trickery more than spirits. But none could deny that her voice had been heard by too many ears, her tricks witnessed by too many eyes, her name repeated too often in too many households for her to be dismissed. The Bells might have been her captives, but the community itself had become her stage. It began with neighbours who visited out of concern. They came to help John in his illness, to comfort Lucy, to protect Betsy. But soon word spread of the voice that answered questions, that recited scripture, that mocked and cursed with a sharp tongue no one could see. Families who had once been skeptical began to send representatives determined to test the witch for themselves. They asked her questions no outsider could know, and she answered with unnerving precision. She told them details of their own lives, revealed secrets whispered in their homes, repeated sermons being preached in churches miles away. Some left shaken, others converted to belief, others unwilling to speak of what they had heard. The gatherings grew larger. On some nights, the Bell home was crowded with neighbours, visitors, even strangers who had travelled from distant counties just to hear Kate speak. Ministers sat side by side with farmers, skeptics with the devout, all waiting in the darkened room for the voice to rise. And when it came, shrill and mocking, or soft and singing, or harsh with curses, the crowd leaned forward, caught between fascination and terror. The Bell household became a kind of theatre, though no one would have dared call it entertainment. It was too real, too unsettling, too full of consequences for those who lived within it, but for the community, it was irresistible. Some visitors came determined to expose the witch as a fraud. They searched the walls, inspected the rafters, watched the children for signs of ventriloquism or trickery, but the voice confounded them all. It spoke when no lips moved. It answered questions before they were finished. It shouted from corners of the room where no one stood. One skeptic demanded proof and whispered a private question in another room, far from anyone else's hearing. Moments later, the voice repeated the words aloud, mocking him for doubting. He left the house pale, refusing to speak of it again. Others came not to test, but to marvel. They asked the witch to sing hymns, and she obliged, her voice clear and sweet, filling the room with melodies no human throat produced. They asked her to recite scripture, and she did, quoting passages with accuracy and ease. Some believed she was a divine spirit, allowed by God to reveal hidden truths. Others argued she was a demon, sent to deceive. Ministers debated her meaning in sermons, warning their congregations against being led astray, even as they themselves returned to the Bell farm, unable to stay away from the voice that challenged their faith. Kate seemed to thrive on the attention. She delighted in large crowds, in testing the faith of the devout and humiliating the skeptical. She imitated voices perfectly, repeating the tones of those in the room or mimicking the speech of distant acquaintances. She argued theology with preachers, sometimes aligning herself with the scriptures, other times twisting them into blasphemous parodies. She mocked men of standing, revealing their secrets before their neighbours. At times she spoke kindly, praising Lucy or encouraging guests, but more often she sowed discord, laughter, and fear in equal measure. The community soon became divided. Some saw the haunting as proof of the devil's hand at work. They warned against entertaining the witch, against treating her words as anything more than temptation. Others argued she was a restless spirit, a messenger of the dead, or even a test sent by God to strengthen the faithful. Still others leaned towards skepticism. whispering that perhaps the bells themselves were behind it, that the family or their children had devised some elaborate deception. Yet, the sheer number of witnesses made such claims hard to sustain. Too many had heard the voice with their own ears, too many had felt its effects, too many had seen Betsy's bruises and John's decline. The haunting spilled beyond the walls of the Bell home. Kate began to insert herself into the affairs of others. She announced illnesses before they occurred, warned travellers of dangers ahead, even guided lost neighbours back to safety. Some began to treat her as an oracle, seeking her counsel in matters large and small. But these moments of aid were always balanced by cruelty, for she never allowed the community to forget her malice toward the Bells. She seemed to delight in proving her knowledge, in showing that there was no corner of the settlement she could not reach, no secret she could not uncover. Even those who had never set foot in the Bell household found themselves caught in the story. Families whispered of hearing strange knocks in their own homes, of voices that echoed faintly in the night, of dreams filled with Kate's laughter. Whether these were true extensions of the haunting or the spread of fear through imagination, they deepened the sense that the entire community was under her shadow. The Bell Witch was not only a tormentor of one family, but a presence that seemed to haunt Robertson County itself. The legend grew with every retelling. Travelers carried the story into other towns, other states. Newspapers picked it up, eager for tales of the supernatural in a young nation still carving its place in the world. The Bell Witch became more than a local haunting. She became a symbol of frontier terror, a story that blurred the line between folklore and fact. Her fame spread so far that even General Andrew Jackson was said to have sought her out, bringing his men to the Bell farm only to be driven away by her power. Whether every detail of these stories was true mattered less than the fact that they were told, believed, and passed down. For the Bells, the attention brought little comfort. Their home, once a refuge, was now invaded nightly by curious visitors. Their suffering became a spectacle, their pain consumed as entertainment or proof. They endured not only the voice of Kate, but the eyes of neighbours, friends, and strangers who came to watch their torment. They could not escape her, even in the company of others, for she spoke louder, more forcefully, when the room was crowded. Their private tragedy had become a public possession, a story that belonged to the community as much as to themselves. In this way, the haunting reshaped life in Robertson County. It was no longer only about the Bells, but about everyone who lived in the shadow of the Red River. Ministers preached of it, skeptics argued about it, families whispered of it, and travelers spread it. The community was possessed not only by the witch's voice, but by the story itself. And as long as the voice spoke, as long as Kate claimed her place in the lives of the Bells and their neighbours, the possession continued, binding an entire county to the fate of one haunted family. From the beginning, Kate had shown signs of uncanny awareness. She repeated conversations whispered in other rooms, mimicked voices she had no earthly way of hearing, and knew the names of strangers who entered the Bell home for the first time. But as the haunting deepened, her knowledge grew more elaborate, more detailed, until it became the trait that most unsettled the community. It was one thing to hear her laughter or her curses. It was another to hear her reveal things that no one else could know. This power made her less like a ghost and more like something omnipresent, something with ears in every home, something that could reach into the most private corners of a life and expose them. The first demonstrations were simple. She would repeat lines of scripture being read in distant churches at the very hour of their preaching. Neighbours came back from Sunday services stunned to hear that Kate had already quoted the sermon word for word in the Bell household. Ministers, shaken, confirmed that what she said was true. Some tried to test her, preaching in whispers, altering their texts, but she still recited them with accuracy. The implication was clear. Kate could be in two places at once, or perhaps everywhere at once, a presence that no wall or distance could contain. Visitors quickly began to test her knowledge. They whispered questions silently in their minds, hoping to trap her, only for the voice to answer aloud, mocking them for thinking they could hide a thought. They asked her about events happening miles away, and she described them in detail, sometimes even predicting outcomes before news arrived. A farmer traveling home from market was described by Kate as he rode along the road, his hat pulled low against the sun. Hours later, he appeared exactly as she had said. Another man's private affairs, kept hidden from his family, were exposed in cruel detail, leaving him humiliated before the gathered neighbors. Kate took delight in such revelations, turning secrets into weapons, stripping away the privacy of those who dared doubt her. What made these demonstrations terrifying was not only their accuracy, but their unpredictability. Kate chose when and whom to expose. Some nights she was content to sing hymns and banter with visitors. On others she turned vicious, revealing private sins and humiliating the proud. Families who had once come to the Bell home eagerly, hoping to marvel at the voice, began to dread the possibility that their own secrets might be laid bare. Ministers, once confident in their authority, found themselves unsettled when Kate recited private prayers they had whispered in solitude, mocking their faith with words only they should have known. One of the most famous examples of Kate's knowledge came when a group of neighbors gathered to challenge her. They demanded she tell them something that could be proven true, something happening far away at that very moment.
Kate paused, then described in detail the return of a family friend from a long journey. She recounted his conversations on the road, the color of his horse, the condition of his saddle. The listeners were skeptical until days later the man returned, matching her description exactly. Word of the event spread quickly, convincing even the doubters that Kate's knowledge was not a matter of chance. Prophecy soon followed. Kate began to predict events before they occurred. Some were trivial: the arrival of a visitor, a change in the weather. Others carried weight. She warned of sicknesses that later struck the community, foretold accidents that came to pass, and described deaths before they occurred. These predictions left neighbors shaken, torn between awe and terror. Was Kate a prophet, a divine spirit allowed to glimpse the future? Or was she a demon twisting her knowledge into cruelty? The question divided the community, but none could deny the accuracy of her words. The Bells themselves bore the brunt of these revelations. Kate predicted John Bell's death months before it came, announcing that she would kill him and that the family should prepare. She mocked Betsy's future, declaring that her engagement to Joshua Gardner would fail, and then tormented them until the prophecy became self-fulfilling. She described illnesses that struck the children, sometimes warning them beforehand, sometimes laughing as they fell ill. For the family, Kate's knowledge was not a curiosity, but a curse, a constant reminder that their tormentor knew them more intimately than they knew themselves. The community, however, could not resist her allure. People traveled from miles away to hear her words, eager to test her knowledge, to seek her prophecies. Some came with hope, asking about lost loved ones or distant kin. Others came with skepticism, determined to expose her as a fraud. Few left unchanged. Too many received answers too accurate to dismiss. Too many heard details they had never spoken aloud. Even the skeptics, though unwilling to admit belief, found themselves shaken by what they had heard. Kate seemed to revel in this role. She was not content to be a ghost scratching at walls. She demanded recognition as an intelligence, one with knowledge that defied natural explanation. She laughed at the fear she inspired, mocked the awe she received, and alternated between cruelty and kindness with dizzying speed. At times she offered genuine help, guiding travelers home, warning of dangers. At other times she used her knowledge to humiliate, to wound, to deepen the suffering of those she despised. This unpredictability made her all the more terrifying. She could be oracle or tormentor, prophet or demon, comforter or destroyer, depending on her whim. For the Red River settlement, the presence of such a being was transformative. It was no longer possible to dismiss the Bell Witch as a private haunting or a trick of imagination. She was too public, too well known, too deeply embedded in the lives of the people. She had become a part of the community, a voice that everyone knew, even if they had never set foot in the Bell home. Children grew up hearing her name, families debated her meaning, ministers preached about her. The Bell Witch was no longer just a tormentor of one family, but a figure woven into the identity of the region itself. Her knowledge, however, remained her most unsettling trait. To live under the shadow of the Bell Witch was to live without privacy, without secrets, without the comfort of believing that one's thoughts and actions were safe from scrutiny. She stripped away the illusions of privacy, exposing lives to her cruel laughter. Whether she was spirit, demon, or something else, she was a power that knew too much, and that knowledge gave her control over everyone who heard her voice. And still, she did not relent. The Bell family remained her central victims, John weakened unto death, Betsy broken in spirit, Lucy enduring in faith. But now the community too was bound to her. They marveled, they feared, they debated, but they could not look away. Kate's voice was too compelling, her knowledge too precise, her presence too overwhelming. She had become more than a witch. She had become an oracle of terror, a voice that knew the secrets of men and the fate of a family, a presence that bound an entire community to the haunting of the bells. From the very first words she spoke with clarity, Kate had made one promise above all others: she would kill John Bell. She announced it openly to the family, to neighbors, to ministers, to strangers who crowded into the Bell home to hear her voice. She mocked him to his face, declaring that he was marked, that his end was near, that she would see him into the grave with her own hand. For years these threats echoed in the air of the Bell farmhouse, becoming a constant refrain. And for years John's health declined, as though her curses took root in his body. His decline was slow, relentless, and cruel. Once a man of strength, John grew frail. His speech slurred, his hands trembled, his face twitched with spasms he could not control. His once firm steps faltered, his body unsteady. He choked on food, his throat closing as if pressed by an invisible hand. He grew gaunt, his features hollow, his eyes sunken with exhaustion. Neighbors whispered of paralysis, of nervous disorders, of wasting sicknesses they could not name. Doctors came with what little knowledge early 19th century medicine could offer, but none could explain his condition. To Kate, the mystery was no mystery at all. She claimed it daily, jeering that his suffering was her triumph, that each fit and stumble was proof of her grip on him. By the autumn of 1820, John Bell was a broken man. He could no longer manage the farm. His voice was often reduced to stammers, and his body failed him more with each passing week. Kate grew louder in her taunts, declaring to visitors that his time had come, that she would not rest until he was dead. She did not speak in vague threats, but in certainty, naming the day she would strike. The family, already exhausted by years of torment, lived in dread as her prophecy drew near. In December, John's condition worsened suddenly. He collapsed into fits that left him near unconscious. His family gathered close, tending him with devotion, while Kate circled them with shrill laughter and curses. She shouted over their prayers, mocked their hymns, and told them to prepare his grave. The house was filled with fear and grief, for they knew the end was near, and they could not escape the voice that promised to claim it. On the morning of December 20th, 1820, John Bell was found in his bed, barely breathing. Beside him, the family discovered a vial of strange liquid, one they had not seen before. They rushed to fetch medicine, but Kate's voice rose in triumph. She boasted that she had poisoned him, that the vial contained the draught she had given him, that no doctor could save him now. When the family tested it by giving a drop to the cat, the animal convulsed and died instantly. The children screamed, Lucy wept, and Kate laughed, proclaiming that John Bell had taken his final dose. Within hours, he was dead. The death of John Bell was more than a family tragedy. It was the climax of the most notorious haunting in America. Kate had promised for years that she would kill him, and now she boasted that she had fulfilled her vow. Her voice rang through the house, shrieking with laughter, singing crude songs, celebrating her victory. For Lucy and her children, grief was made unbearable by the torment of a voice that would not allow them peace even in mourning. For the community, already shaken by years of testimony, the fulfillment of Kate's prophecy seemed undeniable proof that she was no mere spirit, but a power beyond comprehension. John Bell's funeral drew crowds from across Robertson County. Neighbours, friends, ministers, skeptics, and the curious gathered to pay their respects to a man once regarded as a pillar of the community. But even in death, he was not spared. As the mourners prayed and sang, Kate's voice rose above them, mocking the dead man, laughing at the grief of his family, cursing him even as he lay in his coffin. Witnesses were stunned, some terrified, others furious, but none could silence her. The funeral of John Bell became a spectacle unlike any other. A solemn moment turned into another stage for the witch's cruelty. For the Bells, the loss was devastating. Lucy, who had endured with faith and dignity, was left to guide her children without her husband. Betsy, already broken by years of torment, wept for the father she loved and the protector she had lost. The other children, shaken by the sight of his decline and the horror of his death, carried the scars for the rest of their lives. They had not only lost a parent, but had watched him mocked, poisoned, and claimed by an unseen voice that celebrated his end. The community, too, was left reeling. Some whispered that John had been punished by God, that his sins had invited the witch. Others believed he had been the victim of sorcery, of a spirit bound to his old quarrels. Still others argued that he had simply died of illness, though few could explain away the presence of the vial, the death of the cat, or the triumphant voice that mocked his passing. Whatever the explanation, the story of his death spread quickly, cementing the legend of the Bell Witch. For skeptics, the details of the vial became the focus. Some argued that it was poison kept for vermin or medicine misused in desperation. Others claimed the Bells themselves invented the story of the vial to give weight to their tale. But for those who heard Kate's laughter with their own ears, for those who listened to her boast that she had killed him, such rationalizations rang hollow. The haunting had always been defined by her voice, and now that voice had claimed responsibility for death. It was a claim too bold, too triumphant to be ignored. In the weeks that followed, the Bells struggled to find their footing. The farm still stood, the children still needed care, the fields still demanded labor, but nothing was the same. John's absence was a wound that would never heal, and Kate's continued presence made even ordinary life unbearable. She still spoke, still mocked, still inserted herself into their days. His death had not silenced her, it had only proved her power. For the wider world, the death of John Bell became the defining moment of the legend. Tales of strange lights, of bruises on Betsy, of voices in the dark, all these were compelling, but death made the haunting undeniable. A man had died, and the witch had claimed him. The story spread with renewed force, carried by word of mouth, by travelers, by ministers. It reached beyond Tennessee, becoming a tale told in taverns and churches across the South, a story that blurred the boundary between folklore and history. And yet, even as the community whispered of the witch's triumph, the haunting did not end. Kate lingered, still present, still cruel, still entwined with the fate of the Bell family. John Bell was gone, but the voice that had mocked him lived on, a reminder that the haunting was not simply about one man's death, but about a power that refused to release its grip on the living. When John Bell's coffin was lowered into the earth, many in Robertson County hoped that the haunting would be buried with him. Kate had declared her intention from the beginning, and she had carried it out with cruelty that left the community shaken. Surely, some thought, her work was done. Surely she would release the family now that her promise had been fulfilled.
But those who believed the witch would vanish with John's death underestimated her hunger for control. For months after his burial, her voice still rang through the Bell home, mocking, laughing, tormenting the survivors who could not escape her presence. Lucy bore the weight with the same quiet strength that had carried her through years of horror. Widowed, left to raise her children without her husband, she endured Kate's jeers with prayer and dignity. The witch, strangely, still spoke of her with admiration, calling her the best of women, praising her virtue and faith. But these compliments brought no comfort. They were cruel reminders that Lucy was forced to live under the scrutiny of her tormentor, her goodness acknowledged even as her life was poisoned by grief. She gathered her children close, urging them to keep faith, but her words were often drowned out by Kate's shrill laughter echoing through the rooms. For Betsy, the aftermath was unbearable. She had already endured years of humiliation and pain, her engagement destroyed by Kate's interference, her body marked by invisible hands.
Now, with her father gone, she felt even more exposed. Kate taunted her relentlessly, reminding her that she would never know peace, mocking her broken engagement, cursing her youth. Betsy grew withdrawn, her spirit dimmed. Neighbors pitied her, but pity could not shield her. She had become the human face of the haunting, the living symbol of the witch's cruelty. The other children, too, carried the scars. They had lost their father, and they had lost the sense of safety that a home should provide. Their childhood had been marked by fear, their nights by whispers and blows. Now they watched their mother struggle to keep the family together, all while the voice that had destroyed their lives still haunted them. Some would carry the memory all their lives, telling the story to their own children and grandchildren, passing the legend forward. For them, it was not folklore, but lived experience. The community, though shaken, continued to visit the Bell home. Curiosity had not faded. If anything, it had grown. Now that the witch had claimed a man's life, more people wanted to hear her voice, to witness her power. The farmhouse remained crowded on many nights, filled with neighbors and strangers alike. Kate obliged them, speaking, singing, mocking, answering questions, revealing secrets. She seemed to revel in her fame, in the knowledge that she was no longer only a haunting but a legend. The Bells had lost their patriarch, but the community had gained a story it could not let go of. Yet even legends change, and in time Kate's tone shifted. After years of cruelty, years of torment, she announced suddenly that she was leaving. She declared to the Bells that her work was done, that she would depart, but not forever. She promised to return in 7 years, a vow that struck the family with both relief and dread. Relief that they might at last know peace, dread that the peace would only be temporary. With that promise, the nightly torments faded. The house grew quieter, the bruises on Betsy's skin faded, the laughter in the night ceased. For the first time in years, the Bells slept in silence. But silence did not erase memory. The scars remained, both physical and emotional. Betsy carried the mark of her torment into adulthood, her life forever altered. Lucy bore the weight of widowhood and the memory of years spent under siege. The children grew into adulthood with the haunting as the defining story of their youth. And the community, though no longer gathering nightly at the Bell home, kept the story alive in their conversations, their sermons, their fireside tales. The witch had gone, but her shadow remained. 7 years later, in 1828, the promise was fulfilled. Kate returned. The voice rose again in the Bell home, speaking, mocking, testing the family who had once again settled into a fragile peace. But this return was different.
The violence of the earlier years was absent. Betsy, now older, was spared the brutal torments of her youth. John was gone, and Kate had no need to torment Lucy with grief. Instead, the voice engaged in long conversations, speaking of the past, offering reflections, even engaging in theological debates. She seemed less a tormentor than a strange companion, though her presence was no less unsettling. For weeks, the Bells and their neighbors listened to her voice once more,
as she recounted events, predicted futures, and reminded them of the years of suffering she had caused. Some believed she had returned not to torment, but to teach, to leave behind wisdom cloaked in cruelty. Others believed she was simply unwilling to release her hold on the family. Whatever the case, her second stay was shorter. After several weeks, she announced that she would depart again, this time for a much longer absence. She promised to return in 107 years, a prophecy that placed her reappearance in the year 1935. When she left the second time, the Bell home was quiet once more. The family aged, the children grew into adults with families of their own, and life in Robertson County moved forward. But the memory of Kate never faded. The promise of her distant return lingered, a reminder that the haunting was not truly finished. In 1935, some said she did return, though not in the same way. A descendant of the Bells reported strange noises, whispers in the dark, echoes of the voice. Others dismissed it as folklore, the natural spread of a legend through generations. But the prophecy kept the story alive, carrying it across more than a century. For the Bells themselves, the aftermath was marked by survival. They endured, they rebuilt, they told their story. But they could never escape the shadow of what had happened. For the community, the haunting became a touchstone, a story told and retold, embellished and debated, but always believed at its core. And for America, still a young nation in the 1820s, the Bell Witch became a uniquely American legend, born not in the old world, but in the soil of Tennessee, shaped not by imported tales, but by the voices of those who swore they had heard her with their own ears. The witch was gone, but she had left her mark on the Bells, on the Red River Valley, on a community that had been drawn into her possession, and on a nation that would carry her story forward for generations. And as her voice faded into silence, the question remained, had she truly left, or was she only waiting, biding her time until the moment came to speak again? When the voice finally faded from the Bell home, the silence was as heavy as the years of torment that had preceded it. For the family, it meant the chance to rebuild their lives, to heal wounds that would never fully close. But for the community, the haunting did not end with Kate's departure. If anything, it grew. Freed from the immediacy of nightly visits, the story began to live on its own, retold in cabins and churches, around firesides and in fields. Each retelling carried the weight of fear, of fascination, and of memory. What had been a private siege became public property, and in the hands of neighbors and travelers, the story of the Bell Witch transformed into folklore. Folklore thrives in the spaces between truth and imagination, between memory and exaggeration. The Bell Witch was fertile ground for such transformation. Too many people had heard the voice for it to be dismissed as fantasy, yet the details of what she was, why she came, and what she meant were endlessly debated. Some insisted she was the restless spirit of a native displaced from the land, her bones disturbed by the Bell's plough. Others swore she was a demon, a servant of Satan who had chosen the family as her battleground. Still others believed she was indeed the spirit of Kate Batts, returned to wreak vengeance for a quarrel long past. Each explanation took on a life of its own, repeated with conviction by those who believed it, passed down to children who grew up hearing the tale as part of the fabric of their community. Fear kept the story alive as much as fascination. Families whispered of hearing faint knocks at their own doors, of seeing shadows in the trees, of hearing laughter in the night. Whether these experiences were real extensions of Kate's presence or the echoes of imagination hardly mattered. To believe in the Bell Witch was to live with the possibility that she might appear again, that her reach extended beyond the Bells to anyone who crossed her path. Parents warned children not to wander at night, invoking the witch as a reason to stay close to home. Preachers used her as an example in sermons, warning that sin and pride could invite the devil's hand. Even those who claimed not to believe still repeated the story, if only to scoff at it. The power of folklore lies in its adaptability, and the Bell Witch proved endlessly adaptable. In some tellings, she was a moral lesson, a punishment for John Bell's supposed sins. In others, she was a tragic figure, a wronged soul unable to rest. In still others, she was pure chaos, a witch who acted without reason or restraint, tormenting simply because she could. Each version reflected the fears and values of the teller, shaping Kate into whatever figure the moment required. As the story spread beyond Robertson County, it grew more elaborate. Travelers carried it into Kentucky, Alabama, and beyond, adding details to impress their listeners. Some claimed Kate had been seen as a shadowy figure on the road. Others swore she had followed them home, whispering in their ears as they slept. Newspapers picked up the tale, embellishing it further, presenting it as both curiosity and warning. By the mid-19th century, the Bell Witch was no longer just a local legend, but a regional one, woven into the cultural landscape of the American South. The line between memory and myth blurred quickly. The Bells themselves, though they tried to move on, could never escape the story. Descendants grew up in the shadow of the legend, carrying the name of a family forever associated with a witch. Some embraced the tale, telling it proudly, while others avoided it, unwilling to relive the shame and pain of their ancestors. But no matter their feelings, the story persisted, told by neighbors, by strangers, by anyone who had ever heard of the witch. Fear was the story's greatest currency. To speak of the Bell Witch was to conjure unease, to invite a shiver even in daylight. She became a figure invoked in warnings, in jokes, in half-believed tales told to frighten children. But beneath the laughter lay real dread, for too many in the Red River Valley remembered hearing her voice with their own ears. Too many remembered John Bell's decline, Betsy's torment, the vial of poison, the laughter at the funeral. These were not just stories, but events etched into the memory of a community, events that could not be dismissed no matter how much time passed. As the decades wore on, the legend took on the qualities of folklore familiar around the world. She became larger than life, capable of feats beyond those originally told. Some said she could take the form of animals, appearing as a dog or bird before vanishing into the air. Others claimed she could control the weather, bringing storms to punish the wicked. Still others swore she could travel wherever she pleased, her voice heard in distant states, her laughter echoing in foreign lands. The more the story spread, the more it grew, until the witch became less a figure tied to one family and one farm, and more a symbol of supernatural terror itself. Fear of the witch also became a form of entertainment. Stories were told at gatherings, exaggerated for effect, designed to send chills down the spine of the listener. Young men dared one another to walk near the Bell farm at night, to call out her name and wait for a response. Families retold the tale on stormy nights, their children wide-eyed as they imagined the knocks on the wall and the laughter in the dark. The witch became a kind of cultural touchstone, a story everyone knew, even if the details varied wildly. In this way, the Bell Witch entered the realm of folklore alongside figures like Bloody Mary, La Llorona, and other spirits that haunt the edges of cultural memory. She was America's own witch, born not in the old world of Europe, but in the soil of Tennessee, shaped by the fears of settlers carving homes from wilderness, passed down through generations who found in her the embodiment of their own anxieties. She was a story, but she was also more than a story, for the memory of her voice lingered in the ears of those who swore they had heard it. Fear gave her power, and story gave her life. Together, they ensured that Kate would never truly vanish, even when her voice fell silent. She lived in the whispers of neighbors, in the sermons of preachers, in the warnings of parents, in the daring of children. She lived in the tales carried by travelers, in the words printed in newspapers, in the gossip of strangers who had never seen the Red River Valley but knew of its witch. She became folklore, and in doing so, she became immortal. And still, beneath the laughter, the exaggeration, the half-belief of tavern tales, there remained the memory of fear. The fear of footsteps on the porch when no one was there. The fear of whispers in the night when the house was still. The fear of a voice that knew too much, that mocked too cruelly, that celebrated death too loudly. Folklore may twist and change, but fear remains constant, and it was fear that gave the Bell Witch her place in the imagination of a nation. As the decades passed and the story of the Bell Witch travelled far beyond the Red River Valley, it began to attract not only believers, but skeptics. Folklore has always drawn those who accept it as truth and those who seek to strip it down to ordinary causes. The Bell Witch was no exception. By the mid-19th century, when the story had spread through newspapers and word of mouth, it was no longer only a tale of terror, but also a puzzle to be solved. Rational minds, armed with the growing language of science and psychology, began to ask not only what had happened, but how. The first line of skepticism was the simplest: deception. To doubters, the haunting was nothing more than a trick, an elaborate performance by members of the Bell family or their neighbours. They pointed to Betsy, whose torment was the most visible, and suggested that her bruises and cries were self-inflicted or exaggerated. They accused John Bell's children of mischief, imitating voices and staging noises to frighten visitors. In this version, the Bell Witch was no spirit at all, but a prank carried too far, sustained by the gullibility of a frontier community hungry for the supernatural. Others suggested that the haunting was not a trick, but a delusion. Fear, after all, is contagious, and in the tight-knit world of Robertson County, where neighbors lived in one another's pockets, stories spread quickly and took on lives of their own. A knock at the wall, a rustle in the cornfield, the cry of a bird at night, all could be magnified by fear until they became evidence of a witch. Once the story was accepted, every unexplained sound, every illness, every misfortune could be blamed on Kate. In this telling, the Bell Witch was not a spirit, but a mass hysteria, a shared delusion born of fear, faith, and the isolation of frontier life. Psychology, a new field in the 19th century, offered another explanation. Some argued that Betsy herself was at the center of the haunting, not as a hoaxer, but as a victim of psychological distress. They pointed to her age, her adolescence, the pressures of family life, and the limited roles available to young women of her time. In this view, the voices and attacks were the expressions of a troubled mind, externalized into the figure of Kate. Later skeptics would frame this as a kind of poltergeist phenomenon, suggesting that Betsy's unconscious mind projected its turmoil into physical disturbances, knocks, scratches, voices, that terrified her family and neighbors. The witch, in this interpretation, was not a spirit at all, but the eruption of psychological strain. John Bell's death, the climax of the haunting, also drew skeptical attention. Doctors of the time could not explain his illness, but later generations offered natural causes: strokes, seizures, degenerative diseases of the nervous system. His trembling hands, slurred speech, and fits could all be explained by conditions unknown to early medicine. The vial of poison, skeptics argued, was either misunderstood or invented in hindsight to give weight to the witch's claims. The death of the cat, while dramatic, could have been a coincidence or an embellishment. To rational minds, John Bell had not been killed by a witch but by illness, his decline made more terrifying by the superstitions that surrounded it. The return of Kate in 1828, 7 years after John's death, also attracted skepticism. By then the story was already legendary, and any unexplained sound in the Bell home could be attributed to her. Neighbours might have exaggerated ordinary noises, or the Bells themselves, still trapped in the shadow of their ordeal, might have believed that silence could not last forever. As for the prophecy that Kate would return in 107 years, skeptics dismissed it as a narrative flourish, the kind of detail that folklore invents to keep itself alive. When 1935 came and went without a clear reappearance, it seemed to prove their point. But skeptics did not only dismiss the story, they sought to explain its endurance. They argued that the Bell Witch survived because she spoke to deep cultural anxieties. On the frontier, where wilderness pressed close and death was never far, the idea of an unseen force that could strike without warning resonated deeply. The story also offered a moral framework. John Bell, some said, was punished for hidden sins. Betsy was tested in her innocence. The community was reminded of the thin line between faith and superstition. Even if the events could be explained away, the story remained powerful because it reflected the fears and values of the people who told it. Science, too, was brought to bear. In the 20th century, researchers and folklorists began to collect accounts of the Bell Witch, analyzing them with the tools of anthropology and psychology. They noted the consistency of certain themes: the voice, the torment of Betsy, the death of John, alongside the wild variations in detail. They argued that such consistency pointed not to objective truth, but to the shaping power of oral tradition. Stories once told take on fixed points, around which details can shift and grow. The Bell Witch, they concluded, was less a historical event than a living legend, one that adapted to each generation that told it. Yet, for all the rational explanations, doubt never fully erased belief. Too many accounts survived, too many witnesses swore they had heard the voice, too many families passed down stories of visits to the Bell home. Skeptics could argue, but believers could point to the consistency of testimony, the sheer number of people who claimed to have heard Kate with their own ears. The debate became part of the story itself, the tension between faith and doubt, mystery and explanation, feeding the legend rather than diminishing it. In this way, skepticism and science became companions to the folklore of the Bell Witch. They did not kill the story, they kept it alive, offering alternative explanations that only fueled debate. Was Kate a spirit, a demon, a restless soul? Or was she a hoax, a delusion, a projection of human psychology? The questions mattered less than the persistence of the tale, which endured not because it was proven, but because it could not be disproven to everyone's satisfaction. The Bell Witch became a mirror, reflecting both the credulity and the skepticism of American culture. She was a witch to the devout, a fraud to the rational, a psychological phenomenon to the scientific. And in occupying all these roles, she became more powerful than she ever could have been as a single explanation. For every attempt to reduce her to a trick or a delusion, another retelling rose to insist she was real. For every rationalization, another story circulated that could not be explained away. In the end, the witch thrived not in certainty but in doubt, her legend carried forward by the very tension between belief and disbelief. And so, as science grew, as psychology advanced, as folklore studies emerged, the Bell Witch remained. She was studied, debated, explained, and re-explained, but never dismissed. Her story endured because it could not be settled. The skeptics and the believers needed each other, each giving life to the other's arguments. And in that debate, Kate's voice continued to echo, not only in Tennessee, but in the imagination of a nation grappling with the boundary between the natural and the supernatural. The United States in the early 19th century was still inventing itself. Nations older than memory had their ghosts, their demons, their witches woven into centuries of tradition. England had its haunted castles, Germany its forest spirits, Ireland its banshees. These were stories layered over generations, bound to landscapes and lineages stretching back into the mist of history. America, by contrast, was young. Its settlers carried fragments of the old world's legends with them, but those stories belonged to another soil. If the new nation was to have its own supernatural identity, it needed its own ghosts, its own witches, its own terrors born from its own soil. In the Bell Witch, it found one. Unlike Salem's witches, whose trials were remembered with shame, the Bell Witch was not a product of court records or judicial hysteria. She was born in a farmhouse in the wilderness of Tennessee, in the stories of neighbors who swore they had heard her voice. She was not an echo of Europe, but a figure rooted in America's frontier, a place defined by struggle, isolation, and the uneasy balance between faith and fear. Her story carried the rhythms of frontier life, the creaking timbers of cabins, the knocks on walls, the whisper of voices in the night. She was as much a part of the American landscape as the Red River itself. In her, Americans found a legend that was both terrifying and familiar. She did not haunt castles or abbeys, but the home of a family like any other, a family of farmers, churchgoers, and neighbors. That familiarity gave her power. She was not distant, not exotic, not bound to aristocrats or ancient bloodlines. She haunted ordinary people in an ordinary house, and in doing so she suggested that no one was safe. Her story belonged not to a distant past, but to the present, not to strangers, but to neighbors. That made her all the more terrifying and all the more American. As her story spread, she became a point of fascination for writers and storytellers eager to shape a distinctly American folklore. Newspapers carried her tale as proof that the new nation was as haunted as any old one. Preachers used her as a warning of the devil's reach even in a land of promise. Travelers carried her story into taverns and inns, telling of the witch who mocked ministers, tormented children, and claimed a man's life. She became a national curiosity, a figure who reminded Americans that their land, too, had mysteries that defied reason. Her American identity was also shaped by the tension between belief and skepticism. The young nation prided itself on reason, on progress, on the Enlightenment ideals carried across the Atlantic. Yet it was also steeped in revivalist religion, in frontier spirituality, in the conviction that unseen forces moved through daily life. The Bell Witch embodied this tension. She was a story told by devout Christians who saw in her the hand of the devil, but she was also a puzzle for skeptics who sought rational explanations. She lived in the gap between faith and doubt, a uniquely American space where science and religion wrestled for dominance. In time, the Bell Witch became a symbol of the American supernatural, invoked alongside tales of haunted battlefields, restless spirits of Native Americans, and the folklore of enslaved Africans whose stories of tricksters and haints blended into the nation's fabric. But the Bell Witch stood apart, both because of the scale of her torment and because of the sheer number of witnesses. Too many people had heard her voice. Too many had testified to her presence for her to be dismissed as mere fancy. She became a touchstone for what Americans meant when they spoke of the paranormal. Not vague impressions or fleeting shadows, but a presence that mocked, cursed, and even killed. Her story also mirrored the anxieties of the nation itself. The Bells were prosperous farmers, respected in their community, living what many considered the ideal frontier life. That such a family could be torn apart by unseen forces reflected the fragility of the American dream. Success, faith, and reputation were no shields against the terror of the witch. The story reminded Americans that beneath the surface of prosperity lay vulnerability, that no household was beyond the reach of fear. Over time, the Bell Witch became more than a haunting. She became a metaphor. Writers invoked her as a symbol of hidden guilt, of community tensions, of the dark underside of American expansion. Some saw her as the voice of the land itself, restless with the displacement of native peoples and the blood spilled in conquest. Others saw her as the embodiment of suppressed conflicts within the Bell family, a spirit that exposed what could not be spoken aloud. Whatever the interpretation, she became a figure through which Americans explored their own fears, their own history, their own identity. By the 20th century, The Bell Witch had moved firmly into the realm of American legend. She was written into books, dramatized in plays, invoked in ghost stories told to frighten children. Folklorists studied her, historians debated her, locals embraced her as part of their heritage. She became not only a story, but a symbol of place, a mark of Tennessee's identity, a reminder that the American frontier was not only a land of opportunity, but also a land haunted by forces beyond understanding. What made her endure was not only the terror of her story, but its adaptability. Each generation found in her what it needed. For the early frontier settlers, she was proof of the devil's power and the need for faith. For later skeptics, she was a puzzle of psychology and folklore. For modern Americans, she became part of a shared cultural memory, a story that united fear, fascination, and pride in a uniquely American haunting. Unlike imported tales of European castles and ghosts, the Bell Witch was theirs, born of their soil, told in their voices, shaped by their fears. In this way, she became woven into the fabric of American identity. She was not just a witch, but the witch, the figure who gave the young nation its most famous haunting. Her laughter echoed not only in the Bell farmhouse but in the imagination of generations, carried forward by belief, skepticism, and the enduring power of story. She reminded Americans that their land too had mysteries, that their history too had shadows, and that their culture too could claim legends as deep and haunting as any old world tale. And so, long after her voice fell silent, the Bell Witch lived on, not in knocks on walls or scratches on skin, but in the stories Americans told about themselves, in the fears they shared, in the identity they built. She became part of the nation's haunted heart, a reminder that even in a land of progress and promise, the voice of the witch could still be heard, mocking, laughing, whispering in the dark. By the time the 20th century was in full swing, the Bell Witch had long since passed from living memory into story. The last of the direct witnesses were gone, their children aged into grandparents, their testimonies surviving in letters, diaries, and oral tradition. But the story itself refused to die. Instead, it took on a new life, carried into modern times not by whispers around the fire, but by the printed page, the stage, and eventually the screen. The witch, once a voice in the night on a Tennessee farm, became a figure in popular culture, echoing across America and beyond. The first major step came with the written word. In 1894, Martin Van Buren Ingram published an authenticated history of the famous Bell Witch, a book that claimed to preserve the true details of the haunting. Ingram's work became the foundation for much of what the world came to know of the Bell Witch, weaving together eyewitness testimony, community lore, and dramatic flourishes into a narrative that cemented her place in folklore. Though later critics questioned his sources and accuracy, Ingram's book gave the witch permanence. What had once been oral tradition became fixed in print, accessible not only to locals but to readers across the nation. From there, the story spread. Other writers took up the tale, adding their own interpretations, expanding details, reshaping Kate into a figure suited to their audiences. She appeared in regional histories, in collections of ghost stories, in magazine articles that marveled at the strange happenings of America's past. Each retelling carried her further from the Red River Valley until the Bell Witch was no longer just a Tennessee legend, but part of the wider body of American ghost lore. The 20th century also brought dramatization. Plays were staged, using the haunting as material for local theater. Storytellers wove her into performances at festivals, using her voice to thrill audiences. Schools taught her story as part of Tennessee's heritage, children learning that their state boasted one of the most famous hauntings in history. The Bell Witch became not only a tale of terror, but a point of local pride, a symbol of identity, proof that Tennessee had legends as powerful as any other place. Tourism soon followed. The Bell family farm became a site of pilgrimage for the curious. Descendants of the family guided visitors through the land, pointing out where the farmhouse once stood, where John Bell had walked, where Betsy had been tormented. The Bell Witch Cave, a natural cavern on the property, became especially associated with the legend. Guides told visitors that Kate had once retreated there, her voice still echoing in the dark. Tourists came to see the cave, to hear the stories, to step into the shadows of the witch. What had once been a private nightmare became a public attraction, a place where history, folklore, and commerce blended into one. The witch's reach expanded further with the rise of mass media. Radio programs dramatized her tale. Newspapers revisited the story in Halloween features, and television documentaries explored her history. In the late 20th century, filmmakers began to adapt her legend, presenting her as both historical figure and horror inspiration. The Bell Witch became the subject of films ranging from low-budget productions to wide-release thrillers. In some, she was presented as the historical Kate, tormenting the Bells in Robertson County. In others, she was reshaped into a more general spirit, a witch whose voice echoed in modern times, haunting new victims in new ways. Perhaps the most famous cultural echo came indirectly in the 1999 film The Blair Witch Project. Though not officially based on the Bell Witch, the movie drew inspiration from her legend, particularly the idea of an unseen, mocking presence in the woods, one that could not be fought with ordinary means. The film's success and the cultural phenomenon it created brought renewed attention to the Bell Witch, with audiences eager to explore the real story behind the inspiration. Books and documentaries followed, comparing the fictional Blair Witch to the historical Bell Witch, and in doing so, introducing a new generation to Kate's voice. Popular culture also reshaped the witch into a brand. Her name was invoked in haunted attractions, in Halloween events, in ghost tours across the South. Her story was retold in podcasts, in YouTube videos, in online articles that blended history with horror. She became a staple of paranormal television, appearing in episodes of shows that explored haunted sites and unexplained phenomena. Each new retelling brought her to new audiences, ensuring that she remained not only alive in folklore, but active in the entertainment world. What is striking is how flexible she proved to be. In some portrayals, she was the historical witch of Robertson County, bound to the bells, her voice echoing through the farmhouse and cave. In others, she was more general, a spirit of vengeance, a figure of horror who could be transplanted into other settings. She could be presented as tragic, vengeful, demonic, or mysterious, depending on the needs of the story. This adaptability ensured her survival in popular culture, for she could be whatever the audience needed her to be: a ghost for historians, a witch for horror fans, a tourist attraction for thrill seekers. And yet, beneath the commercial gloss, the core of the story remained. People were still drawn to her not only because she was famous, but because she was frightening. The idea of a voice that mocked, that knew too much, that tormented and killed, it resonated as powerfully in the modern age as it had on the frontier. Technology could dramatize her, culture could commercialize her, but fear kept her alive. She was still the witch in the dark, the whisper at the bedside, the laughter in the night. In this way, the Bell Witch became a bridge between history and modernity, between folklore and pop culture. She connected the frontier cabins of the early 19th century to the movie theaters of the 20th, the sermons of country preachers to the ghost tours of modern Nashville. She was not trapped in the past, but alive in the present, her story retold again and again, her voice never silenced. Her echoes in popular culture also ensured that she would never belong solely to Robertson County again. She had been born there, her story rooted in the Bells' suffering, but she had grown into something larger, something national, even international. Wherever her name was spoken, in books, on stage, on screen, she carried with her the memory of a family haunted, a community possessed, and a nation that had found in her its most enduring witch. And so, the Bell Witch lived on in popular culture, not as a relic, but as a presence. Each retelling, each dramatization, each adaptation added another layer to her legend. She became not only a ghost story, but a cultural icon, one whose voice continued to echo long after it fell silent in the Bell farmhouse.
The Bell Witch has lingered for more than 2 centuries, her story told and retold in cabins, churches, classrooms, theaters, and movie screens. What began as a private nightmare in a Tennessee farmhouse became a legend that crossed generations, spreading far beyond the Red River Valley. Yet for all the words spoken, for all the books written and films produced, the heart of the story remains unsettled. She endures not because she can be explained, but because she cannot. She is a mystery that refuses to be solved, a voice that continues to speak even in silence. Believers still insist on her reality. They point to the sheer number of witnesses who claim to hear her voice, from neighbors to ministers to strangers who had no stake in the Bell family's reputation. They remind skeptics that the events were not whispered in secret, but played out before crowds, that her words were recorded, her songs remembered, her threats fulfilled. They point to John Bell's decline, to Betsy's bruises, to the vial of poison found at his deathbed, and they say these things cannot be dismissed as tricks or imagination. To them, the Bell Witch was and is real, proof that unseen forces move among us, capable of torment, prophecy, and death. Skeptics, for their part, remain unmoved. They argue that memory is fragile, that testimony is shaped by fear, gossip, and the hunger for story.
They point to the unreliability of Martin Ingram's 1894 book, the primary written source of the tale, and remind readers that much of it was compiled decades after the events, when details had already shifted into folklore. They suggest John Bell's illness had natural causes, Betsy's bruises were the result of hysteria or self-harm, and the voices were tricks played by clever children or neighbors. They argue that what mattered was not what happened, but what people believed happened, and that belief was enough to create a legend. Between these two poles lies the enduring fascination of the Bell Witch. For every rational explanation, there remains a detail that resists it. For every claim of fraud, there are accounts of ministers and strangers who left shaken by what they heard. For every psychological theory, there is the stubborn memory of John Bell's death and Kate's triumphant laughter at his funeral. The haunting is a puzzle with missing pieces, a story that refuses to fit neatly into either faith or skepticism. That resistance is what keeps it alive. The Bell Witch is also a mirror, reflecting the fears and values of each generation that tells her story. For the frontier community of the early 19th century, she was proof of the devil's power and the need for steadfast faith. For the skeptical minds of the 20th, she was a case study in mass hysteria, trickery, or psychological projection. For the modern world of the 21st, she is a cultural icon, a figure who bridges history and horror, appearing in films, podcasts, and ghost tours. She is never only one thing, never bound to one meaning. She is a shifting presence, adapting to the needs of the time, surviving because she refuses to be pinned down. Her endurance is also rooted in the human need for mystery. In a world increasingly explained by science, increasingly mapped and measured, the Bell Witch remains a corner of darkness that resists illumination. She reminds us that not everything can be solved, that some stories remain beyond proof, beyond certainty. She is a reminder of the limits of knowledge, a challenge to the confidence of reason, a whisper that the world still holds shadows we cannot dispel. The land itself seems to hold her memory. The Bell Witch Cave draws visitors who walk its cool passages, listening for whispers in the dark. The fields where the bells once farmed are quiet now, but those who stand there sometimes swear they feel a presence,
as though the air still carries her voice. Tourists and locals alike speak of strange noises, of laughter on the wind, of shadows that move at the edge of vision. Whether these are tricks of imagination or echoes of something real hardly matters. The story has made the land haunted, and in haunting it has made it sacred in its own way, a place where history and legend meet. The Bell family, too, remains bound to her. Descendants carry the weight of the name, some embracing the story as heritage, others wishing to leave it behind. They are asked about it, written about, drawn into a legend they did not choose. For them, the witch is both burden and inheritance, a shadow they cannot escape, a reminder that the past never truly releases its grip. And so the Bell Witch remains, not silenced by time but carried forward by it. She is a voice in folklore, a subject of skepticism, a figure in American identity, a character in popular culture. She is fear and fascination, belief and doubt, history and story. She is a mystery that refuses to fade, her laughter still echoing in the imagination of those who hear her name. What truly endures is not whether she was real, but the power of her story. The Bell Witch reminds us that stories themselves have force, that belief can shape reality, that memory can outlast death. She is a witch who may have spoken from the shadows of a Tennessee cabin, or she may be only the voice of fear given form. But whether she was spirit, fraud, or something else entirely, she has endured. Her voice has not gone silent. It lives in the telling, in the fear, in the fascination. And perhaps that is her greatest triumph. Not the torment of Betsy, not the death of John Bell, not the laughter at the funeral. Her true victory is that 2 centuries later, her name is still spoken, her story still told, her voice still heard.
The Bell Witch endures not because she can be explained, but because she cannot. She is the enduring mystery, the laughter in the dark, the whisper in the night that will not go away.